Welcome to Culture, Power, and the Pen, a podcast where we explore the voices and stories of Asian minority communities. I'm your host, Andy, and in each episode, I'll sit down with writers, activists, and storytellers who use their words to reclaim identity, challenge narratives, and illuminate the experiences of their people. For our very first episode, I'm honored to be speaking with Kao Kalia Yang. She's an award-winning Hmong-American writer whose works capture the power of memory, survival, and belonging. Through her books, including Somewhere in the Unknown World and The Sound Poet, she explores the history and challenges of her community, giving voice to the Hmong experience and ensuring that their stories are remembered and recognized. To understand the significance of Ms. Yang's work, it's important to know the historical context of the Hmong people. During the Vietnam War, many Hmong were recruited by the CIA to fight in a secret war in Laos against communist forces. When the U.S. withdrew, the Hmong were left behind, facing persecution, imprisonment, and death. Thousands fled through the jungles to refugee camps in Thailand, and over the years, many were resettled in the United States. Approximately 100,000 Hmong refugees arrived in the U.S. between the late 1970s and early 2000s. A large number of them eventually settled in Minnesota, drawn by strong resettlement programs, available social services, and the promise of a stable community. Today, Minnesota is home to the largest urban Hmong population in the country, and it's where Ms. Yang lives and writes. Today, we'll talk about what it means to write from the margins, to find power and resilience through literature, and dive into stories that celebrate the identity, culture, and experiences of Asian minority communities. Enjoy. What do you think first sparked your love for writing as a child?
I was born in a refugee camp, Andy, and when I was born, I couldn't go to school or anything. And so I grew up listening to the stories of my elders. I learned how to love stories long before I understood that my life in my professional life would be in writing. At the feet of my elders, I'd sit there and let the winds of their words carry me far away. Because a refugee camp is a small space, limited in so many things, in so many ways. It was through the stories of my elders that I could see a world beyond the fences.
So, in what ways are your writing and storytelling influenced by your Hmong heritage and identity?
My people have been divorced from a written language for many, many, many years. We were first introduced to the written form again in the 1950s when a French missionary came to the high mountains of Laos to translate the Bible. So the medium that I'm working in is a new medium for my people, not just for me. But I believe so much in its importance. I grew up with a deep love of story, and then that love of story translated into a love of books. In America, Mom and Dad both had to work really hard as assemblers in a factory to make our lives possible, which meant that the source of so many of the stories that I loved was suddenly taken away from me by the factory clock. And so the public library shelves introduced me to a different kind of array of stories. So growing up, I always had this dream and a wish that one day there would be books about my people on those shelves. My mom and dad, especially my father, who's a beautiful song poet in the Hmong tradition, he's always said, words have to write on memory, that they have to be meaningful, that they have to touch on the core importance of being human. And I think that is something that I try to do very much in my writing. And then like Chinese, Hmong is a tonal language. So every breath that we breathe carries into the world. On the page, I'm continually paying attention to breath control. How much air am I taking from my readers? How much am I giving back? That's a relationship that I think is very much founded on the fact that I'm a native Hmong speaker. Although my first language on the page is English, I didn't go to school until we came to America and I was 6 years old. But so much of the way I connect to the earth, the environment, for example, Hmong people are the backdrop of we are farmers everywhere we are. So in Thailand, some of the best farmers are Hmong. Same with French. I don't know if you know this, but in France, the Hmong in Nice and Nimes, they do a great deal of the farming. And here in America, if you visit a farmer's market and there's a Hmong population, you will see Hmong farmers selling. And so in my own work, vegetation, growth, gardens, they play a very important role.
I've actually been to like a farmer's market and met many Hmong farmers over there. They're really nice people. And
Yes, oh, wonderful. So you know exactly what I mean.
yeah, awesome. So how do you find, power and resilience through literature as a Hmong writer and activist?
When I'm writing, I'm trying to correct history, in the form of memoir, in the form of fiction, in the form of, across audiences, because I write for both adults and children. I had my first middle grade novel come out last year. I am finishing edits to my first young adult memoir. So I'm writing for a broad range of audiences. And I think that every time a reader gets to meet me on the page, they get to meet the beating heart of Hmongness. I'm not shy about being Hmong. I incorporate Hmong languages into my work, names, places, and always I'm saying we are here and our stories matter too. And our stories have to have the power to make our lives better. They're important pieces of history. They're important pieces of imagination. Not only for Hmong children, but for all children. We live in a shared world.
Can you share maybe like a moment when writing really helped you or empowered you during like a difficult time in your life?
Yeah, so I was a kid, a teenager, and my mom and dad both worked at the factories, as I said. They didn't earn very much money, so we would inevitably end up overdrafting on our bank accounts. And my mom had these horrible migraines, Andy, whenever we'd overdrafted because they charged like $37 that we didn't have. So she would go through the house trying to look for quarters and dimes, whatever she could find to make up the deficit. And it was always very little. It'd be like $1 over on the gas or something like that. And I would get so sad watching my mom and knowing where we were positioned, how tumultuous our life in America, our financial and like the social construct of everything was. And so I go into my room and I would journal, Andy. I would write everything that was weighing on my heart down. I'm still a chronic journaler. I have boxes and boxes of journals. It takes me 2 months to fill up a whole notebook. And so writing is my way of uploading all of the issues of a bigger world, of freeing my heart and my mind to go beyond. It is what allows me to keep a sense of myself in a world that I think is continually tearing at all the pieces of who I am. And so it's not just one instance, it's been the instance of a lifetime. I continue to journal, and I imagine I will until the very end. And when all is said and done, Andy, the University of Minnesota has expressed interest in the papers of Kao Kalia Yang. But these journals are for me. I've told my husband, I've told my children, when I go, I want you to burn all these journals up. They were just for me all along the way. And so in that way, the most stories I've told, the most I will have ever written would be for me. And I think that is a beautiful thing.
So, how do you feel, about Hmong stories in literature today, and what kind of gaps do you see in kind of the stories that are being told?
There aren't enough. If you Google Hmong-American writers, I'm sure you'll find me, Kao Kalia Yang, and then you'll find a poet named Maidova from California. There are very few of us doing what we're doing on a national stage. And so because we're only 2 people, I'm sure there's so many other stories that need to be told. It's not even the idea of what's in the gap. It's the fact that we are writing from the gap. And we're just points along the spectrum. Our power will be utilized when all these points get connected. I don't know if I will live long enough to see that happen. But for what I'm worth, for what I have to give, I'm going to give it. I'm going to give it everything I've got. And my stories, if you know anything about my body of work, they're tender in nature. I have a tender heart. I gravitate toward everyday men and women, toward the neighborhoods I love, toward the people and places that have made me who I am. And so in that way, they're very localized, although I believe their contents are universal and the thematic inquiries have relevance for all of humanity. I'm a humble person, and I think my tales are humble. Maida, who's working from the other coast, I'm a Midwestern author. Maida is working from California. Her poetry, I think, connects deeply with that part of the country, and also her positionality. And so The question is interesting. What are the gaps? There are way too many to count because I know exactly who's doing what from where they're positioned. There's a writer called Lori M. Lee in Wisconsin who's writing middle grade like sci-fi stories, and those are incredible. But I can count on my hands how many published and working authors there are in the land, which means that there's not enough of us.
Awesome. I think what is really amazing about, almost transcending literature is, finding your identity and your stories. I think like what makes like a story really good is, you putting what makes you part of, your story. So, in terms of cultures more shifting towards, culture, traditions, and community, how do you and your family celebrate, traditional Hmong holidays such as the Hmong New Year?
I belong to Jumua and Biya, my mom and my dad, and they are, we come from a shamanistic ancestral worship tradition. I was born and we lived for a long time in the refugee camps of Thailand, so Buddhism surrounds us. And then, of course, we're now in a Christian nation predominantly. Every dollar, every coin says, "In God we trust." So in that way, I think our religious and cultural foundations are really international, shockingly. People don't think about Hmong people or other refugees necessarily in international terms, but I think it is entirely true and valid, which means that, when it's Hmong New Year time, we understand there's going to be a January 1st celebration coming when we get to reflect on all of the year. But for Hmong New Year, my dad will call our spirits in with eggs and chickens. He'll stand at our door, we'll burn sticks of incense, and he'll call out to our spirits, our wandering spirits across the stretch of the old year, and invite us into the new one, into the warmth of family and friends, to eat and rejuvenate and replenish our souls so that we are ready again for a new year. And then at the end of that, we each get an egg, and the eggs represent our spirits. It's an incredibly beautiful tradition. When my grandmother was alive, we used to do like mochi cakes. So you would steam baskets and baskets of sticky rice, and then you put it into a wooden trough, and you would pound it into like actual mochi cakes. That's one of my favorite treats even today. We don't do the whole trough and the actual physical thing anymore, but there's a mochi maker at mom and dad's house, and they will steam rice and they will make mochi cakes for all of us to eat with cane syrup, and it's such a treat. So these are traditions that I would love to continue forth for my children. But I should say, Andy, I'm in an interracial relationship, so my kids are less connected to my language and the culture of my home than I was. And I understand that they are positioned differently, and that the obstacles and challenges and the traditions that they grow up with are even more melded in many ways than my own. But I think it's such a gift for them to be able to experience New Year's at my mom and dad's house. And in my own heart, that I want to continue this forward as far as I can.
I really connect with part of, the mochi. I think, it's such an important part of, Asian culture. Like for my culture, like a lot of times we would eat mochis on, these holidays, and we would put like red beans in there, and it's such a form of comfort and a way almost to calm the spirits of, a hard year. And it's amazing to see, that connection. And how do you see, the younger generations really engaging with the Hmong culture, and what gives you hope for the future?
So the younger generation, they're growing up in a world here in St. Paul, Minnesota, where there are Hmong immersion schools. So not only are they learning how to speak the language, but they're learning how to read and write it, which was never possible when I was coming up, because we were newcomers to America. We didn't have the foundations to have Hmong immersion schools and stuff like that. I live in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and this is the biggest urban settlement of Hmong in the nation. It is the biggest urban settlement of Hmong in the world. And so there's like a mass here. And with that, there's like Hmong village and Hmong town where you can go get traditional Hmong food year round. Not possible when I was growing up. So there are these structures in place now to uphold the culture and to make sure that it survives. And I think it's a beautiful thing. At the same time, I do understand with social media and the internet and the virtual possibilities out there, Asian is now much more tenable. And so there's Hmong kids who are influenced by K-pop and H-pop and everything else, and you can see that those influences coming into like the young. My daughter, for example, has New Jeans posters all over her room, and they're not Hmong women. They're women from around the world coming forth from Korea. But I think it gives her a different idea of what Asian is on an international scale. And that was something that my generation had to discover for ourselves in time. But for these young ones, it's right at their fingertip. And I think it allows them opportunities that we never had to imagine ourselves in the world, to conceive of possibility. That is a beautiful thing. At the same time, I understand that there are certain families where the language is the Hmong language is dissipating, and that's also sad. In my own home, my daughter's doing an okay job. I sent them to Hmong camp last summer, and they loved it. And my hope is that I can do so again this summer, because I want them to have a community, a sense of community, and also just access to the language that I love so much. I think Hmong is such a beautiful language.
I think, I really connect to the part where, social media is constantly, influencing and impacting, the younger generations and, their perception of, different cultures and different, kind of how they perceive, the world, right? And, moving on, to the topic of, legacy and maybe reflecting a little bit, who are your role models in your life and your work that you're doing?
So for my work, I look to models like Louise Erdrich, who's a Native American writer, one of the most well-known working in contemporary America. I look to historical figures like Baldwin, like Angelou, like Morrison, because I think all of these people are writing on behalf of communities, and they understood, in process that the stories that they were telling were important for the whole world. Even as they were speaking forth from and for particular communities. In terms of my personal life, I think about all the women who I come from. My grandma, the one that I got to meet and to love, who's now been gone for 22 years. She's the reason why The Late Homecomer was written, my very first book. I think about her strength in a time of war. When so many died, she, an old woman, somehow survived and kept her children alive. That is incredible. It's an incredible feat. And then she would, of course, go on to love and nurture so many of us, her grandchildren. I think about my other grandmother who I never got to meet, but who I look like. And when I think of her, I think about how easy it is to get lost in the others of time without physical connection, without stories binding us tight. I think about all that is at stake. And then, of course, I think about my own mother. She has survived so much, and she's taken the hits, Andy. My mom is now free from PTSD, from the consequences of war, the impacts of poverty, and yet her love for us remains so true and so beautiful and so selfless. Her courage to tell us continuously that her love is secure in a world when so many things are not. What an incredible woman I belong to. And so I start thinking and I start believing, if all these women that I belong to are so incredible, aren't I as well? Can't I do it as well? And in many ways, I have done it and I am doing it, just like the women before me.
Awesome. I think my mother also played an important role in, inspiring what I write as well, like from, just the way that she cared for me. I think a lot of times I put that into my own writing. I've actually written like a kind of like a poem about, Doudiju, which is a sort of game, like a card game that we would play. It's like Big Two, I think, in, that's what kind of Americans play, but it's really cool as well. So it's that connection really hits me. And as the last question, and also like an open-ended question, what are your favorite stories?
Right now, I'm reading Jasmine Ward, Let Us Descend. Right before this, I was reading Hernan Diaz In the Distance. Right before that, I was reading Stephen King's Holly. And this is all this year. And then in between all of these things, I'm just reading a lot of student work. I teach writing as well. And the thing that I know I love every time I enter into a story, whatever the format, whether it is a movie or I love movies too. I should say this. I love stories across the word or across the board, or a painting. I love art. I think the reality is I love stories that are honest, stories that are brave, stories that show me what it is like to be human. Not a superhero, but a human in the face of all that the world delivers. I love stories that let me get to know the human experience better, to feel it more deeply. But above and beyond all of these things, I love stories that make me feel deeply. I can think, and I think quite often, but stories that make me feel deeply, I really gravitate toward. And that's what I try to do in my books.
Awesome. That'll be the end of episode 1 of Culture, Power, and the Pen. Thank you so much, Miss Yang.
Thank you, Andy. That was wonderful. Your questions are wonderful, and I really appreciated the connections that you made between me and you and why we do what we do. So thank you.